Hello, my name is Jeanette Sasek, and I am a project officer with the GAP program. I've been here, I started working with the EPA and with this program just after the last annual conference, so I haven't met any of you in person, but I'm hoping that that will change in the near future. So I appreciate this opportunity to present this session, and good to virtually meet you all. And Juliann is my co-presenter. Go ahead, Juliann.
Hi. Yeah, so I also work in the tribal branch at the EPA Region 9 office in the GAP program. I'm a project officer for a number of GAP grants, and also you might have seen my name in emails or maybe my face somewhere. I'm also the RTalk coordinator, so busy with that work as well. But I'm happy you guys are here so we can kind of just do an overview of GAP and talk a little bit about what is and isn't eligible for the program. Oh, and I should mention that we have Pam Overman, who's also a GAP project officer, and she's going to help us with monitoring the chat box and maybe answering some questions as well. So we're really thankful that she's here because she has a lot of experience in the program and is very seasoned.
Yes, thanks so much to Pam for joining us. And if you do have questions that come up during the presentation, you can type them in the chat box, and yeah, Pam will be helping us to keep an eye on that. Good afternoon and welcome to this session. Again, it's the overview of GAP and GAP eligible activities. And we'll be covering some of the basics of the General Assistance Program, and we're hoping that this will be a useful session for those of you who are new to working with GAP, but also for those of you who are looking for a refresher. We'll be covering a lot of material, but we'll be sure to pause about midway through the presentation to address any of those questions that are in the chat box. So again, feel free to put questions in there if they come up. And before we get into the nuts and bolts of the GAP, let's review the learning objectives for this session. To be able to define GAP and know its guiding principles, be able to define capacity building, understand that the statute, regulations, and guidance contain key information on how to administer GAP grants, and understand what types of activities are eligible for GAP grant funding. And later we'll review to see if we've achieved these objectives and also to test your knowledge with an online poll. So just as a heads up, if you would like to participate online with this poll, be sure to have your smartphone handy. So what is GAP? GAP is shorthand for Indian Environmental General Assistance Program, or sometimes referred to as IGAP. It is primarily a grant program where the funding is used to build a tribal environmental protection program, and the activities must tie to an EPA-administered program. And we'll have a list of these EPA-administered programs a bit later in the session. It's intended to assist tribes and intertribal consortia in developing the capacity to manage their own environmental protection programs and developing and implementing solid and hazardous waste programs. And just a note on intertribal consortia, they're a partnership between two or more Indian tribal governments authorized by the governing bodies of their tribes to apply for and receive assistance. They're intended to provide training or support for a group of tribes. And before moving on, I just want to let you know that we'll be showing a lot of reference documents and websites for topics that we cover today. And just so you know that these documents and websites will be shared on a resources slide at the end of the program, such as for these guiding principles. And the presentation's available to download from the media tab on the session page. So what are GAP's guiding principles? To ensure tribal governments have the opportunity to build their capacity, to promote tribal self-governance, to promote intergovernmental collaboration and cooperation, to support the implementation of established solid and hazardous waste regulatory programs, and to maintain strong national program management practices to produce compelling results. And you'll notice that 2 of these topics are highlighted in bold, and later on we'll be talking more about capacity building and implementation of solid and hazardous waste programs in more detail. How did the GAP program start? Congress passed a law, the Indian Environmental General Assistance Program Act of 1992, directing the EPA to develop and administer the GAP. This law describes the authority, purpose, and limitations of the GAP program, and some of these points are outlined here. The law provides the parameters of the program for both EPA and grantees. GAP can only fund 1, capacity building activities for tribal environmental programs, and 2, implementation activities for solid and hazardous waste programs for Indian lands. And funds must be used in accordance with the terms of the assistance agreement. We'll go over some of the regulations. This one, the regulations for 40 CFR, or Code of Federal Regulations. Part 35, Subpart B, establishes programmatic requirements for Indian tribes and intertribal consortia for the environmental programs listed in the subpart, and this includes GAP. And these requirements include eligible recipients and activities, components of a complete application, time frame to submit applications, changes to work plans and budgets that require approval, elements of the evaluation process, and GAP award limitations. Another set of regulations are 2 CFR Part 200, which are the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for federal awards. So, whereas the 40 CFR Part 35 Subpart B applies to tribes and intertribal consortia and environmental programs, including GAP, these regulations uniformly apply to all federal awards. And you should check internal policies and procedures of the tribe to make sure that they at least meet the federal requirements. These regulations may answer questions that come up for you, such as how do I determine if my budget costs are allowable, reasonable, and allocable? Why and when do I need timesheets? Can I hire a contractor without any competition? So these sorts of questions come up, of course, and it's a great exercise to try using this important reference by looking up the answers to these or other questions that come up. And so we're going to look at a couple of these questions a little bit more closely. The first example is, what rate can I charge when I travel? Here you can find that the rate should align with the non-federal entity's written travel reimbursement policies in the highlighted section, or in other words, the tribe should have its own policy in place. However, in the absence of an acceptable written policy regarding travel costs, there are established rates and amounts that can be used. And example 2, can I toss my deliverables at the end of the grant project period? As you can see here, there are retention requirements that can be referenced in the regulations. And of course, these are just excerpts from a couple of regulations, and you should always be sure to read the full section of the regulation for context. If after looking it up, you still have questions about your specific situation, you can always ask your project officer. And then we come to the General Assistance Program Grant Guidance, or simply known as the GAP Guidance, as we usually refer to it. The GAP statute also required EPA to create procedures for the GAP program, and thus we have the GAP Guidance, which contains information such as the purpose, allowable and unallowable activities, requirements found in statute and regulations, EPA tribal environmental plans or ETEPs, and indicators of tribal environmental program capacity. It's very useful to be familiar with the GAP guidance. Use it to help you guide the development of your program and to be successful under GAP. Read it, highlight it, tab it, talk to your PO about it. This and the regulations that we just covered are what your PO is referring to when questions do come up. And so I just want to pause here to check in to see if there are any questions in the chat box before turning it over to Juliann for a closer look at capacity building. Pam, is there anything we need to address right now?
There's no questions yet in the chat box.
Okay. Then I will go ahead and turn it over to Juliann.
Hi everyone. So this is the, if you see my video, I'm not sure. This is the lovely GAP guidance. You can find it online. We're going to have the link to it at the end of our presentation and our reference slide. But I also have a hard copy, and I recommend if you're a grantee to print one out and tab it. It's a great reference for a lot of your questions when you're developing your work plan and trying to figure out what is and isn't eligible. And as Jeanette says, there's lots of ways you can use it. Sometimes I'll just go online and hit Control F to search for keywords, or I have these tabs for different program areas. Next slide. So as you heard from Jeanette, a big part of our GAP program is the goal of trying to build capacity. So what do we mean by that? So we define it as when a tribe or intertribal council, like what they need to have in place in order to have a comprehensive and sustainable environmental protection program. And some of those things include for your staff, developing their knowledge, skills, and capabilities. Also for your office, developing the administrative, fiscal, and management capabilities or capacity. And also strengthening the relationships with other partners, stakeholders in the communities. These partners could be with like tribal partners, or they could be with nonprofits or states or federal agencies. So anything that any agency or any organization that you could use to leverage, we would definitely support as a capacity building activity. And finally, developing plans, codes, ordinances, and strategy. That's a big part of the work we fund through the GAP program. The plans could be things such as your EPA Tribal Environmental Plan, your ETEP, which sets out your environmental priorities for your tribe, or it could be your Integrated Solid Waste plan as well. So there's lots of different plans you can develop through this program. Next slide.
Sorry, I'm just having trouble advancing this right now.
No problem.
There we go.
Okay, so something you hear about is when you're working on your work plan, you're going to have your activity, but there's also going to be a part where you're supposed to put down the capacity indicator. And so I wanted to go over what that means. So capacity indicators demonstrate that the tribe has attained a certain capability. And capacity building activities are what we fund. And then if you continue on the slide, you can see that they lead to, yep, keep going, your ability to implement or your goal. So the capacity building activity is what we would be funding, and the capacity indicator is the goal, like what you're hoping to lead to. An example is you might request to fund some initial training on wastewater, for a wastewater discharge program. And your goal would be to establish such a program. So we like to see, there's a bunch of capacity indicators in the GAP guidance, and we like to see the link between what is being funded and one of these capacity indicators. You can also develop your own capacity indicator. You just would need to work with your PO to get that approved. And all the capacity indicators are in Appendix 1 of the GAP guidance. Next slide.
Sorry, Juliann, just for some reason sticking here and there.
That's fine. So I talked about this a little bit, but here gives you some ideas of GAP activities we would approve if you're planning and developing your environmental program. If you're providing training, so we could fund training and development of new skills for your staff. But here's an important aspect that tends to get overlooked, is that the activity needs to relate in some way to a program administered by EPA. And there's a list of these in the GAP guidance. So here are the programs that are administered by EPA that you can also find within the guidance. So anything from air to water to our FIFRA, our Pesticides Act. So these, as long as you can have some kind of nexus there, and also it is capacity building, those are the type of things we look for before deciding whether or not an activity is eligible. Next slide. Something else that we can fund is establishing baselines to develop your capacity. So what are your tribe's baseline environmental conditions? And that information is important to determine the needs for your tribe and the priorities for your tribe. So you can gather existing data that's available, or you can use GAP funds to collect new baseline data in order to prioritize environmental issues. There is an asterisk there. It says it does not refer to ongoing monitoring programs. The reason is because with the exception of the solid waste program, we can't fund implementation and monitoring. Ongoing monitoring is considered implementation of a program. Also, something to make note of is if you're collecting new data, it does require an EPA approved QAP, which is a quality assurance project plan. And so that we have a quality assurance team that can help provide technical assistance and help you develop those plans. So there's also information in the GAP guidance on conducting a baseline needs assessment in Appendix 2. Next slide. Something else that you can find within the GAP guidance is that we can fund performing test drives of a program to establish capacity. So basically, you're going to run the program for up to 4 years, and it's a way to collect information and evaluate an effectiveness. So if it's more than 4 years, then it's considered implementation of your program. And test drive is the language that's used in the GAP guidance. So it's another way of saying maybe a pilot project, but specifically called test drives within the GAP guidebook. So that's the language we use. Next slide. So I've been talking about capacity building as one of the things that GAP funds can support. Another thing is implementation for your solid and hazardous waste program. It is the one implementation, it is the one area that we can fund implementation activities. And these are what would apply to facilities generating and managing the hazardous waste. We can fund those type of activities. And to non-hazardous waste disposal facilities, we can fund those implementation activities. There's also the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2018, which lays out some more flexibilities of what implementation activities can be funded in this area. Again, the guidance describes what the criteria, approvals, limitations of funding these sort of implementation programs are. We do in Region 9 require an integrated solid waste plan before GAP dollars can go towards implementation. Next slide. And so once a tribe has established a waste management program, so build the capacity to have that program in place, these are the types of implementation activities GAP funds can be used for: program administration, having a compliance and enforcement program in place, perhaps for your codes, solid waste management, resource recovery, so recycling and resource conservation support. And then the last one is cleanup and closure. There are some stipulations with that, which I'll talk about a little bit, I think, in the next slide. But if you wanted to read more about, that's fine. If you wanted to read more about what the indicators are, they're within the GAP guidebook. So cleanup and closure activities, we will evaluate requests to use GAP resources for dump cleanups. But we do ask these two questions. One is we want to see that the tribe has taken specific actions towards building a sustainable waste management program to make sure that the community has access to a sustainable program before doing dump cleanups, with the exception of if we find the dump presents an imminent and substantial endangerment to human health or the environment, then we would fund it regardless. So these are the kind of the things we would look at, and when we would ask the grantee to provide us information, fill out a form, and then we send it to headquarters for approval. That's all I want to say on this point. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk about a few questions that come in fairly often. One is, can GAP be used to set up an indoor air quality program? And as you saw, the answer to that is yes. And then I put some of the capacity indicators that could be used in your work plan if you wanted to fund this. Let's say you wanted to fund indoor air quality training for your staff. Well, there's an indicator that would link to that. Also, let's say you wanted to conduct an indoor air quality assessment and report. That is also an indicator available. And I wanted to raise your attention that there is going to be a tribal air program session tomorrow afternoon. Excuse me, I have a tickle. Okay, next slide. Can GAP be used to help with drought and water conservation? So the answer to that is also yes. So let's say you wanted to establish a community outreach and education program that's related to water conservation. Well, there's an indicator right there that you can use to link to those activities. Or there's another indicator about establishing water efficiency policies and programs. And this is considering everything that's been going on with climate change. This is a really relevant issue. Next slide. So another request we get a lot of, can GAP fund a replacement vehicle? The answer to that is, it depends. So we'll see, is this vehicle necessary for your tribal environmental program? Is it going to be used for multiple programs? I think we have a limit in Region 9 now of 30,000. So we do look to see if we think the costs are reasonable. So oftentimes our grantees will purchase a used vehicle through GAP, using GAP funds. So it will be evaluated, but we do look at a number of factors before making that determination. Next slide. What have we learned so far today? Just to kind of recap the learning objectives, Jeanette talked about what GAP is, General Assistance Program, and its guiding principles. We talked about what capacity building is. Jeanette went over the statute regulations in the guidance. And then we talked a little bit about what type of activities are eligible for GAP grant funding. And then, yes, as Jeanette mentioned, we are going to do a little fun test to see how you guys can figure out what is and isn't GAP eligible. And then just to let you know, after we do this poll, we'll get to your questions. I've seen there's been a bunch of questions coming into the chat box, so keep them coming. I really appreciate it.
Are you seeing the QR code?
Not yet, no, just the presentation, so you might need to switch.
Okay,
to
yeah,
another
let me.
window.
That should be it.
Okay, so we'll give everyone a minute to get this up. So you can either use your, if you have your phone available, you can use the your QR code reader, or you could just put that link straight into your browser. You don't need to use a reader. Or sometimes if you just take a photo of it, it'll just pop up. So there's options. I just always use the link. It's not so long.
And just on the photo, if you just turn your camera on, you don't actually take a photo. You just
okay, thank you.
and then it'll prompt you to click on the link on the web.
Yeah, I just tried it with my camera. At the very top of my camera screen, it says to connect to that in Safari, so it worked on the iPhone.
Yeah, it works on the Pixel as well. So we've tested a few platforms.
Okay, we'll give it, I haven't started it yet. I see some people in the chat box saying, please, it needs to start. I'm waiting for people to get it ready before starting.
And of course, if you're not able to participate online, you can just follow along with the questions too and answer in analog.
Okay, so the first question, and for each of these activities, we're assuming that the costs are necessary, reasonable, they're aligned with your tribe's EPA Tribal Environmental Plan or ETEP. So can you use GAP funds to conduct non-point source outreach and education? Great. I love all the participation. All right, so I'm going to hit next. Yes, and the answer is yes, it definitely can be used. Outreach and education activities are one of the most popular picks of activities to be funded with GAP funds. And it's considered capacity building for your program. You're reaching out to the community. So this is definitely eligible. Next question. Again, assuming that the costs are reasonable and aligned with your ETEP, collecting baseline air quality data. Okay, so the answer is yes. So everyone got it right. The only reason I put it depends is I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that you do need to have a QAP, Quality Assurance Project Plan, in place. But yes is also a correct answer. Pesticide misuse inspections in Indian country. Is this a GAP eligible activity? Okay, great. This is pretty much evenly split, so it's a good question. And if you just signed on, sorry, you'll just have to watch as we go along in the poll. I don't have the link available, I don't think, to share in the chat box. So the answer I have is no. It depends if you, I suppose if it's considered a, if it's the beginning of your program and you're considering it as a test drive, then maybe you could argue it for it, or you can justify it as it depends. But otherwise, I would say no, because it's considered implementation. There is EPA funding available for this. There's funding through OECA, through our pesticides program. So if this is something that your tribe does want to fund, there is funding available. You would just need to go through the pesticides program in our regional office to apply for these funds. The next one is working to enter into a joint environmental protection program with a neighboring state. Is this a GAP eligible activity? Okay, great. So I put this down as yes. I'm wondering, okay, so a few people said no, a few people said it depends, and many said no. In general, entering into partnerships or funding partnerships with other organizations, if it leads to one of our capacity indicators where you're building capacity for your tribe, then yes, it's considered GAP eligible.
I'd just add, I think there is an indicator for developing MOUs with other entities regarding your environmental program. So we can help you find that if you're looking to do that.
Thanks, Pam. All right, next one is developing a climate change adaptation plan. Great, I love all the participation. So yes, that is something that is within our GAP guidance within the AIR program section, I believe. You can read up on the climate change adaptation work that GAP funds can be used for. All right, test driving for 6 years, an integrated pest management in schools program. Okay. So it's kind of a trick question. We do test drives, but we do limit it to 4 years. So that's why I put 6 years down. So after 4 years, the program would have to be funded through possibly OPP, Office of Pesticide Program dollars, instead of using the GAP program funds. I used to work in the pesticides program, and I know how important IPM, or integrated pest management programs, are. You know, something else that GAP funds can be used for is for exploring other sources of funding and applying for grants. Conducting dump cleanup and closure activities. So yes, this is another one where yes is a fine answer. I just put it depends just to bring up the point that there is a process in place where a form has to be filled out. We have to get approval from AIEO to get the funds for this. And just to make sure that the tribe has a sustainable solid waste program in place. But it is something that is eligible for funding. So yes is correct. Okay, I think this is the last one. Developing an emergency response plan. I see the chat box. Someone says pretty much all the yes answers also, it depends. That's true. You could say it depends for pretty much any question in general, except for the ones that are no. All right, so let's see what the answer to this one is. So I put it depends on this one. We can fund the chemical response related aspects, if that's the focus of the plan. But all hazards response plans should be funded with FEMA dollars. And so that's why I put it depends. Just so that, again, it has to have that link or nexus to one of our EPA administered programs. And with that, we can get back to the PowerPoint. Thanks everyone for participating.
I just wanted to say one thing. I think this is a great way also for grantees to think about as they're doing their education and outreach programs, using surveys like this. I think it works pretty well. And it's a good way to determine knowledge before and after presentations you're doing, you know, out in your communities.
Thanks, Pam. I use direct poll. I find I know there's a bunch out there, but I find it's really useful.
Oop, looks like
Yeah, you have to click on the slide you want to start on. So just escape.
yeah, I thought I did here. Sorry about that. Just trying to get back up here. All right. So just continuing on and wrapping up the session, as you can see here, we have a really great group of project officers. And at the bottom here, I'm sure you're all well aware of who your project officer is, but at the bottom here's a link to the tribal program contacts. And so if you go there, you'll see a list of project officers and which grantees they are working with.
Jeanette, we might want to mention that there's a lot of heads and bodies being rearranged here. So the bodies don't always match the heads.
Just to say, there should be a question, what's wrong with this picture?
Right. And we're also missing a few people, which hopefully we'll have added for the next one.
No in-person retreats lately.
Yeah. And then, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, this is the slide that has a collection of reference documents and links to websites. And just to point out in particular, the AIEO produced a really great video that's at the top here, Tribal Environmental Self-Governance and the Indian General Assistance Program video. that I'd encourage you to take a look at as well. Along with, of course, all of the regulations and the gap guidance and such that we covered today. And with that, we are concluding this session. So I just want to check in and see if there are any questions from the chat box for us to talk about.
Sure. So I'll start back someone when you were first talking about the gap guidance. They asked how to get a gap guidebook. I put a link in the chat box for the page that where you can find the gap guidance and other gap documents. So it's our web page.
That's great. And also the gap guidance is on this this slide of links as well.
And I'm finding the PowerPoint for this, so I can put that link in as well.
There was a question from earlier in the presentation. We were told before we couldn't participate in meetings with other agencies like Fish and Wildlife under our GAP grant. Is this true? I would just say first off that as long as we can somehow link it to an EPA program, it could be GAP eligible. And as you know from the survey we did or the poll, a lot of the questions start with, or the answers start with, it depends. So we do need to talk to you about your specific situation and the specific meetings that you want to attend. But if we can link it to one of the EPA programs, it should be eligible.
So Pam, this is Melody Cease from the Epi Nation of Santa Isabel.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we have with our quarterly meetings, Fish and Wildlife has a tribal quarterly meeting. So, you know, we go to that to find out like what's coming down the pike, you know, if the tribe needs to be involved in anything. So it's not like we set, well, we do sometimes work with Fish and Wildlife, but you know, if it's not on a GAP eligible thing, then we work with them outside of our GAP time. But like for the quarterly meetings, we were told before that that wouldn't be, I mean, we couldn't track our time for that meeting.
Okay, we need to probably talk to you about that and what happens at the quarterly meetings. So if you're linking it, say, to developing water quality standards or something like that, that would be affected by Fish and Wildlife, that could be eligible. But if it's something like wildlife protection, those activities aren't under an EPA program, so we wouldn't be able to pay for those. So I don't know if you need to allocate your time, you know, part of the meeting or
yeah, because well, so the meetings usually have like if there's funding coming down, you know, and it's not just Fish and Wildlife. They bring other, so they bring like NRCS, they bring a bunch of different agencies in also, so that it's like a big quarterly meeting, so we can find out like where there's funding that we could go after that would you know, like supplement our environmental protection funding, and but there's usually a lot of good stuff in them, and it just doesn't make sense to me to not allow us as GAP employees to be able to participate in something like that.
Yeah, I understand. So we could probably look at the agendas and see if we could either allocate part-time, or if it's mostly GAP eligible, we could probably cover it. So we probably just want to talk to you about that.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see. The next question is, once a tribe has reached capacity in an area, can that area still be covered under GAP? I'm not sure if there's clarification on that one, but usually once you've reached that capacity, you have to move on to another activity, or else it's considered implementation once you've achieved a capacity indicator. Sometimes we're able to refund them if you need to reestablish technical capacity. If you've lost capacity due to staff turnover, things like that. So once again, it depends. So we would want to talk to you about your specific situation. Juliann and Jeanette, jump in if you have anything else to add.
No, it's just important that we can justify that you're building capacity for your tribe. And all this is important because sometimes we get audited and we want to make sure that the funding is eligible for the activities. So we're doing it to kind of prevent any issues.
Right. There's another question here from Ryan Marshall. Can GAP funding be used for replacement of EPA 106 water quality monitoring equipment? I think we would need to talk about that and see if you're doing, if you're developing your water quality monitoring program. If you're getting an existing 106 grant to do those activities, normally it needs to be paid for out of that program's grants. There are some exceptions within PPGs. So if you have a PPG, a performance partnership grant where multiple grants are combined, there might be a little more flexibility in that area. But normally, normally we don't, GAP doesn't, a standalone GAP grant doesn't pay for EPA 106 water quality monitoring equipment. Can planning for a CRV buyback recycling center probably be GAP funded? I know we've done that in the past, and it's part of developing a recycling program. So up until the planning portion of it has been GAP eligible. So we'd be happy to talk to you about that if you're considering developing one of those centers. Roberto Gutierrez said there is a presentation on indoor air programs later today. So if people have questions on those kinds of activities, feel free to join that session later today. Melody asked if the slides are going to be available later on. And I think all the presentations are going to be on the conference website, so they will be available.
I think the presentations are on the media tab of that particular sessions page.
So I think there's also maybe the recordings that are going to be available.
Yeah, the presenters are supposed to provide those a week in advance too. So some of the sessions that are happening a couple weeks out, you might not find the PowerPoint, but they will eventually be there.
So there's a question, how soon can you replace your vehicle? So if you have a GAP vehicle that needs replacement, we would just talk to you about, we do have some questions we ask you, you know, how old is it? Why do you need replacement? Things like that. So if you normally, I think it's been in the past at least 5 years, a lot of vehicles we funded have lasted a lot longer than that, hopefully. So just talk to your project officer if you have questions, and we'll talk to you about the justification that would be needed. Melissa from San Pasqual said she added the guidance to the media section on the session page, so the GAP guidance link is there.
Thank you.
Camille asked for the link in the chat box. I, up above earlier, put the link to the GAP guidance page in the chat box, so that should be there. There's a comment that I've never QR coded before, so hopefully that was fun for everyone. People were questioning that, was it only for iPhones, but I think we did answer that. It worked for most of the other phones. So if you had a problem with your phone, we'd like to hear about it. Maybe after the fact, you can contact one of us and let us know, because we're hoping it works for all the phones. Someone said I tried it on the computer and it says, please stay tuned, Carrie. So hopefully that worked for you once we opened up the poll.
Yeah, I just kind of waited a minute or two just for people to sign on. So that might have been the problem, hopefully.
So we have a question, can I use GAP for protection and conservation programs? So I'd say in most cases, if it's not developing the tribe's environmental program and that one of those activities falls under one of EPA's programs, which are outlined in the GAP guidebook, if it's not within those areas, then I think most likely it's going to be a no. But talk to your project officer if you have a specific question about a program that you're interested in. And I just want to clarify, we talk interchangeably about the GAP guidance and GAP guidebook. Just so you know, the GAP guidance includes the GAP guidebook. The guidebook is an appendix to the guidance. So we usually reference those two documents as the main part of the GAP guidance. Some people were late to the poll, so it looks like they didn't get in. Someone else said it would depend on if that state is in the same region, but I'm not sure what that relates to. Which question?
Oh, then I think it was like forming a partnership with a neighboring state. You know, that question, the GAP eligible activities. Does that state have to be within Region 9 for us to support that work?
And I don't think it would have to be within Region 9 because we do have tribes that are on the border and some actually cross state lines. So as long as it's related to developing your environmental programs and developing an MOU with them, it should be GAP eligible.
I just want to pop in here with a time check too. I think we just have a couple of more minutes to wrap up. So I don't know if there are 1 or 2 more questions to address or not.
A lot of people were laughing about the "it depends" questions. Where'd you say we could get a copy of the presentation? So we already covered that. We have links to the guidebook again. How do we get the reference links? Maybe that was the last slide.
Yep. If you download the presentation from the media tab, then you should have all of those links.
So there's some thank yous.
Here's a question. I'm only hearing about vehicle replacement. What about a purchase for a new program? You're purchasing a new vehicle for a new program.
A new GAP program?
I'm not sure if that's what they mean. Yes, that's what they mean.
So it sounds like maybe it's a question, we've never had a vehicle and want to purchase one.
Right, I think.
So I would just talk to your GAP project officer about that. We do try, as we're funding tribes grant programs, to fund everyone's core programs first, supplemental equipment. If we have the funds, we will definitely try and work with you to get a GAP vehicle if you have a need for it. We have a question. We have a Clean Air Act 105 grant. Can we use GAP to support a QA officer's salary for roles and responsibilities within the tribal QA program? Once again, probably it depends. We would need to talk to you about it, but if you're developing a QA program, we might be able to help you with that. But if it's running a QA program, it would probably be considered implementation. So there might be an issue with that.
Okay. And it looks like it's time for us to wrap up the session. So hopefully we...
All the questions, so good.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for your help, Pam. And thank you to everybody. Yeah, thank you to everybody for attending the session and especially for all of the great participation.
Yeah, I'd just like to say at one point I looked and we had 100 people on the session. So that's great. Normally during the conferences, we only can have like 30 people squeezed in a room. So it's great. Everyone got to it.
Never hesitate to reach out to your project officer to ask questions. That's what we're here for.
Yes. Thank you to everyone. And thank you, Melissa, for hosting.
Thank you, Melissa.
No problem.
So most of the next sessions start at 2:45, is that right?
It's actually 2:30. For some reason, we forgot the break in between, so I'm going to have to end this in order to start.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.